Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday the 11th of February in London. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Lizzie Burden. Coming up today, the EU says it'll respond to Trump's tariff plan on steel and aluminium with countermeasures.
Ahead of the EU's warning shot, Donald Trump warned the tariff rate may go higher than 25%.
Plus, wait and see. BP pledges to lay out plans for a strategy reset as results underwhelm.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The European Union says it will respond to any tariffs the US might impose on it. The warning comes after President Trump pushed forward with his pledge to place a 25% tariff on all US steel and aluminium imports. The US administration says the broad tariffs will go into effect on the 12th of March. Referring directly to the proposal of metal tariffs, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that if imposed on the EU, they would, quote, trigger firm and proportionate countermeasures.
The EU response comes after Trump insisted that the proposed tariffs on steel and aluminium imports would help boost domestic production and bring more jobs to the United States.
Protecting our steel and aluminum industries is a must, and today I'm simplifying our tariffs on steel and aluminum so that everyone can understand exactly what it means. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions. And that's all countries, no matter where it comes from, all countries. If made in the United States, however, there is no tariff, is zero.
Trump's move comes on top of new 10% tariffs on goods from China and 25% levies on Canada and Mexico that are currently paused for 1 month. The latest measures are meant to crack down on what White House officials said were efforts by countries like Russia and China to circumvent existing duties.
Now, despite Trump's insistence that there would be zero exemptions, the US president says he will give consideration to a carve-out for Australia. Those comments were also echoed by the country's Prime Minister after a call between the two leaders.
I presented Australia's case for an exemption, and we agreed on wording to say publicly, which is that the US President agreed that an exemption was under consideration in the interests of both of our countries.
Anthony Albanese there, who has been under intense political pressure to secure tariff exemptions for the country's steel and aluminium exports to the US. Both leaders cited the US trade surplus with Australia as a key reason for any carve-out.
The growing prospect of a trade war comes as the UK's new ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson, says it's important for allies to respect Trump's electoral mandate. The comments come after Trump suggested last week the UK may avoid tariffs, saying the relationship can be worked out. Here's what Lord Mandelson told the BBC on his first day in the role.
We've got to take all these issues as they come, realise that the President has a very strong and clear mandate for change in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we're going to agree in Britain with every single detail of what he does, but we have to respect and understand what drives him, what his mandate is to do, and how his allies need to adjust sometimes.
Peter Mandelson also told the BBC that his past criticisms of Trump were, quote, ill-judged and wrong. In 2019, the Labour politician reportedly called the US leader a danger to the world in one interview.
To earnings now. BP has pledged to deliver major changes to its strategy as it reported results that will likely add to pressure on the oil major. Adjusted net income for the fourth quarter was $1.17 billion, which is down from around $3 billion last year and a miss of the average analyst estimate of $1.3 billion. But Bloomberg's Sam Munstead says investors will need to wait for details of what the CEO has dubbed a reset.
If you were hoping that today's BP results would have something to do with what they're going to do with their strategy, what kind of changes they're going to make, I'm afraid you might be a touch disappointed because they are saving all of that until the 26th of February. There is a line in the report saying that we are going to have a kind of fundamental reset of our strategy. That is broadly what everyone kind of already expects, and it's a question of whether that fundamental reset is going to meet what, say, Elliott and other shareholders want.
Sam Munstead there talking to us after Bloomberg learned that activist investor Elliott had built a significant holding in BP.
OpenAI CEO Sam Altman has rejected a $97.4 billion bid by an Elon Musk-led group. In a post on Musk's X platform, Altman said, "No thank you," instead offering to buy the social media company for a tenth of that price. Bloomberg intelligence analyst Mandeep Singh says Musk's bid was unexpected.
Everyone is fixated on, lowering the cost. So our view is there will be more consolidation, but I didn't anticipate this form of consolidation where you end up seeing a hostile bid, where clearly I think given Microsoft's stake in OpenAI, there's no way you could see a deal like this.
Bloomberg Intelligence's Mandeep Singh reacting to that news, which was first reported by the Wall Street Journal. Musk and Altman have been locked in a long-standing feud over the direction of OpenAI. The two men worked together as founders, but animosity grew as the ChatGPT creator moved towards becoming a for-profit business.
Well, those are your top stories this morning. On the markets, we have the Stock 600 flat to the upside. S&P E-mini futures are down 0.25%. And ahead of Powell's testimony later, the US 10-year Treasury yield is higher a basis point at 4.5%.
Well, in a moment, we'll bring you more on how the EU is planning to respond to those latest steel and aluminium tariffs in the United States. But Lizzie, I just wanted to mention the story that I've been reading this morning on the Bloomberg terminal, and this is the new list of Michelin-starred restaurants in the UK and Ireland.
I'm too hungry for this conversation.
I mean, there's some good names on there. So we've got Moore Hall in Lancashire that's got its 3rd star, and our food editor Kate Crader has been writing about some of the dishes you might have there. For example, local Dorset Sika deer on the menu there sounds very tempting. Gordon Ramsay's restaurant kept its 3 stars. He's just opened a new restaurant here in the city as well.
12 seats?
Yeah.
What are you going to do with 12 seats?
What, are you suggesting you have to fill them all?
Yeah, you need more than 12 seats.
Nah, exclusivity. That's what people are paying for. Quiet luxury. Look, it's a great list to read some of them. Nice to see the likes of Oma and Borough Market getting its 1st star as well. 22 restaurants getting a new star across Britain and Ireland as well. A couple of great Irish names in there as well. Lignum and Galway on the Morrison Room and Carton House and Kildare getting their 1st star. So plenty to inspire you in that piece. You can read more on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal.
Well, let's get back to the latest on the tariff news. And the European Union says that it will impose countermeasures against the latest US tariffs on steel and aluminium. We have our Brussels bureau chief Kevin Whitelaw with us now, and from Berlin our correspondent Oliver Crook, and our markets reporter Valerie Teitel with us in studio. So all bases covered here. Kevin, I want to start with you. This is in response to the US tariffs on steel and aluminium. What exactly has the EU said?
The EU has said in the sort of tersest way possible that it views this as unlawful and will impose countermeasures if it stands. They're trying to avoid specifics, and they are trying to leave room for negotiation. These tariffs don't take effect until March 12th, which does give the EU and every other country in the world at least some theoretical time to have conversations with the Trump administration to see if there is something they're looking for that could either lower or avert the tariff threat.
We know that the EU has been preparing for the potential of tariffs being imposed. What do we know about what has been prepared for? What are the likely next steps we could see the EU taking?
Well, yeah, the EU had been prepared a detailed list of potential retaliations, but it was also based off of everything from across-the-board tariffs on all goods, which is one thing that Trump had floated at one point, to obviously more specific issues. When it comes to the metals, aluminum and steel, this revives a fight from the first administration. And so when the Trump administration did tariffs on these metals the first time round, there were a set of retaliatory measures the EU took. On things like, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Levi jeans, Kentucky bourbon. That could all come back, or it could be slightly different, or it could be a different set of things. So the EU has a couple of different options, but the truce that had been called under the Biden administration over this trade fight was due to expire at the end of March. So this fight was going to come back one way or another, probably. I think Trump has just made it come back faster.
Ollie, Olaf Scholz has also been speaking about this morning. What's he been saying?
I mean, listen, what we heard from Scholz is basically the usual stuff that we've been hearing from many of the European leaders, basically saying how harmful this is going to be, not just to the Europeans, but also to the Americans, how basically the EU will have to respond in kind, but their option, it's not their preferred option to have a trade war, and that they hope that they can fix the sort of misguided path of tariffs, and that can still be sort of avoided. I think that the main question for everybody from the Europeans, in Brussels or Berlin, it's basically, what does Trump want, right? What is the negotiation? Is this just going to be a pure negotiation? Is it just about closing the sort of trade gap? Is it going to be bigger than that? And I think that's going to be the main question. Is it going to be potentially about tech regulation, antitrust? Could it be about NATO spending? Could it be, maybe Greenland? These are all going to be sort of the questions, and trying to get an understanding of what this administration is thinking. The good news for the Europeans is that they're going to have their first basically high-level contact with the Trump administration later this week in Munich, where you have J.D. Vance, you have Marco Rubio, you have Keith Kellogg, the chief envoy for Ukraine and Russia, that will be coming to Munich and to Germany, and will be meeting with some of these leaders for the very first time.
Oliver, how exposed is Germany's economy in particular within the European Union to these tariffs on steel and aluminium?
Yeah, so listen, whenever we talk about trade with the United States and the issues that it provokes for Europe, any issue it provokes for Europe is mainly an issue for Germany. So basically, the EU had a trade surplus with the United States of about $230 billion last year. If you look at just the surplus between Germany and the United States, it was more than 70 billion euros. And that was a record last year, right? And the total trade between Germany and the U.S. is about $250 billion euros. So this is basically a tariff that really hits the Germans the hardest. But, this stuff flows both ways. I'll give you just one example. Mercedes-Benz, for example, right? They have factories in Europe. Obviously, they have factories in the United States. But many of the SUVs they sell in Europe, which are being produced and assembled over in the United States. So, of course, a lot of the exports are going from Europe to the United States, but they go both ways. When you talk specifically about steel, Germany is the 7th biggest exporter of steel into the United States. It's about $3 billion last year. So listen, in the scheme of things, it's not the sort of biggest category, but again, it's another headwind for a German economy not in need of headwinds.
So, Valerie, where are we seeing this showing up in the market, if anywhere?
Look, the reaction is fairly muted here, Lizzie. There is some trade to the downside in basic resources here in Europe, those exposed to the perhaps the metal trade, the aluminum and steel tariffs, the tit for tat. But we're not really seeing a risk-off move in the equity market. The Eurostoxx 600 is still holding up pretty well. S&P futures didn't really react. And then finally, in the FX market, the reaction there hasn't been, anything eye-catching. Euro is still unchanged, and there wasn't really a jump in gold. So it seems like the market is reading through this for now, perhaps thinking that the ball is now in Trump's court. We know that he might announce reciprocal tariffs either today or tomorrow. Perhaps the market is just waiting for that announcement before drawing any conclusions from the EU's move today.
Yeah, it is very interesting to see that sort of muted market reaction again, and this is sort of in line with what we've had since we had these tariffs first mooted by Trump on Sunday evening as well. The EU's Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has been speaking in the European Parliament in Strasbourg this morning. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We will always protect our interests from unjustified measures in line with our values. And this time has come, and we are currently assessing the scope of the measures announced overnight and will be responding in firm and proportionate way by countermeasures. We will act to safeguard our economic interests. We will protect our workers, businesses and consumers.
That's Maroš Šefčovič there, the Executive Vice President of the European Union. Let's go back to our Brussels Bureau Chief, Kevin Whitelaw. Kevin, the hope for at least some countries in response to these tariffs would they be able to carve out an exception or an exemption from them. We know that the Australian Prime Minister has already had a conversation with Donald Trump about it. What hopes will there be on the EU side that there is room to negotiate here without things getting, dare I say it, out of hand?
Well, obviously, I think, the EU has taken a certain amount of solace in the notion that some of Trump's early tariff measures did result in negotiated truces or delays. And so I do think that they are optimistic. And I think that it does actually explain the sort of measured nature of the statement. Basically, they didn't threaten specifics. They didn't take an overly harsh tone, but they did make clear that they're going to have to do something. So that something is obviously going to depend a lot on how these conversations are going forward. But I think everyone who's dealing with this administration has to understand that the risk of continually getting into negotiations is that you just end up with a series of concessions that simply delay something without actually providing countries with any certainty that they've actually escaped, the entire cycle of this. And we're going to watch that with Canada and Mexico. They only got a 30-day truce in that first tariff threat from the Trump administration. So, if he just comes back and wants more, that's going to, the EU and others may have to take a different lesson from that.
Ollie, can we just talk about how this is going to play into the domestic politics in Germany? What might it do to change the election campaign in Germany?
Largest impact on the election campaign in Germany from the Trump camp has probably been Elon Musk and his sort of getting involved and backing the AfD and having these sort of strange outbursts and sort of participating very kind of actively as an advocate for the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right group that, wants to leave the Eurozone, that wants is much more protectionist and much more sort of nationalist in all of its sort of and all of its sort of messaging. In terms of what it will actually mean for the economy, again, this is going to be absolutely huge sort of mood music if this stuff moves forwards. I mean, again, it's a big if. And there's no way around the fact that, again, what Germany is staring down is a sort of couple of years of a coalition that has been very sort of clumsy, didn't get along. Obviously, it resulted in the government collapsing. We are now looking at potentially a third year of contraction in Germany that has literally never happened, 3 years of consecutive contraction since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The only possible silver lining, I think, politically for Germany is that actually things get so bad that these political parties need to make really difficult compromises and really do something in order to turn the economy around, to stimulate the economy and really think much more radically about what they need to do to turn the economy around. Maybe for the CDU and the Conservatives, that means looking at the debt brake and thinking about other and more creative ways to stimulate the economy. Potentially for the SPD, it means cutting back some of the social welfare things. These have all been sort of chronic sticking points that have basically made it impossible for things to move forward politically. And potentially, Trump changes that. Potentially, though, also it doesn't. And it just sort of slowly, the economy sort of limps on and things get worse and worse and worse.
Kevin, the EU is, of course, at its base a trade bloc, so the response comes from Brussels. But could we see a situation where certain European countries will be trying to negotiate side deals or exemptions for products that would particularly affect them? Is there a European unity question here?
I mean, there definitely is, maybe less so on the metals tariffs than on sort of some of the bigger across-the-board conversations that are going down. But yes, there's a definite concern that countries will have an incentive to try to cut their own deals, and there is also some worry that Trump may actually want that and may want to look to fracture the single market and European unity. So he may start offering that. So obviously that could happen with his closest allies, such as Hungary's Viktor Orban, or it could happen with individual economies and leaders who are worried about the impact. Particularly when you look at how many of Europe's economies are indeed struggling right now.
So, Val, the back and forth has begun between the US and the EU. What are the key points that markets are watching for now as this plays out?
Well, look, Lizzie, if we go from just the one-sided US announcing tariffs to a tit-for-tat trade war, that will really turn this trade from an FX trade to an equity market trade, right? We're not necessarily worried about dollar strength or euro weakness. If we do get combative tariffs from either side of the Atlantic, the risk really is going to show up in equity market sentiment souring and perhaps a further bid into gold.
Okay, Valerie Titell, our market supporter, thank you very much. Just a final question to Oliver Crook in Berlin. Of course, we're talking about the impact on the election campaign here as well. Friedrich Merz from the CDU is currently the leading candidate in the polls to be the next chancellor there. Should we expect any divergence on this issue between Olaf Scholz and Friedrich Merz?
I mean, listen, I think that the only sort of positive thing potentially if Olaf Scholz gets replaced is just the fact that we know that there's a great disdain on the Trump side of things for Scholz, in Germany. We've had, obviously, again, most of that has been through Elon Musk, through Twitter, basically calling Olaf Scholz a fool and being very, very critical of the German government. I mean, listen, I don't know that Friedrich Merz is the sort of most dynamic, charismatic, sort of deal-cutting kind of person that, that Trump would like to work with. that. I think he tries to style himself as someone who's closer politically as a conservative. But again, what was interesting, and he was stressing over the weekend in the debate, Friedrich Merz, that is despite the fact that, again, there was all this controversy about him voting with the AfD on this question of immigration, and the AfD is obviously a very anti-immigration party, very anti-Europe party, Friedrich Merz is still very pro-European. He's saying that basically the only way that we're going to be able to stand up to the United States is if we work together as a bloc. And to sort of Kevin's point, what we were talking about, there is, of course, always the fear that this can draw fragmentation within the European Union, because in moments of economic and sort of political instability, many people tend to go towards a nationalist sort of view. But I think there is a consciousness, certainly from the CDU, that the only way that Germany is going to make it out of this is in sort of solidarity with Europe.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.